lecturette 6. We're going to talk about how we regulate ventilation. So we're starting to get really, really, really small into the small mechanism of how we increase and decrease ventilation rates. And so the mechanism is via these little tiny structures called chemoreceptors, right? And chemoreceptors measure chemicals, right? So we have chemoreceptors that are the same receptor, but they reside in two areas. And that's why you folks are seeing this line drawn in the sand, if you will, is because we have central chemoreceptors, and they will be in the central nervous system, hence the name central, and they're going to measure now CO2 levels in the cerebral spinal fluid. That's not an F. Fluid. All right. Now, there are also peripheral chemoreceptors. And they're in the periphery, specifically in two major arteries, carotid and aorta. And they can measure carbon dioxide, they can measure oxygen levels, and they can measure hydrogen ion levels in the blood, right? So this is two major fluids in our body: the periphery, blood; central nervous system, cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to draw a few structures here. So let me change my pen color, and I want to first draw a big capillary. And this capillary bed is going to be just one long tube. Just to denote capillary bed in the brain and spinal cord, capillary bed in the periphery. Okay, what is this? A capillary. Let me label. Capillary. Okay, now I also want to now draw a couple structures in the brain. Let me go back to, what color should we make it? I should have thought this through before I started talking. Let's make it purple. All right, now I'm just going to draw a little area here. It's going to be the arachnoid. Oh my gosh. Okay. This is going to be my little drawing for the arachnoid space. And this is going to be all cerebral spinal fluid, all in here. Okay. And then down here, all denoted by the squiggly line, this is going to be the medulla oblongata. All right, now let's change my pen color, and I'm going to change it to black. Click, 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 clickety, click. Okay, now let's start off with increasing plasma CO2. So I'm going to increase plasma, that's in the blood, plasma partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which means I've increased the levels of carbon dioxide in my body. You folks got that? Remember, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that's how we have to denote concentrations, by saying partial pressure. Now, this increase of partial pressure is going to be now in the capillary bed, and it's going to be both in the periphery and in the central nervous system. So ultimately, whenever you get CO2 in water, right, in the body, we know that via CO2 plus water, we know that we are going to make hydrogen ions, because I dissociate, and then I'm going to have my buffer, HCO3 negative. Okay. Now, the CO2 and the hydrogen are going to be floating around in the body, right? So as I now have CO2 levels enter the capillary or the bloodstream that's entering the brain, this is what's going to happen. Now, remember, CO2 is nonpolar. So guess what it can do? And just cross over the blood-brain barrier. Okay. But guess what happens to the hydrogen ion because of the astrocytes? Can they cross? No, sorry, they cannot. And that's why central chemoreceptors are mostly measuring CO2. Okay. Now, as I have CO2 enter here, I know this is the chemical reaction I didn't write here because I ran out of space. I'm sorry, I'm not being thorough. Damn space. I need a bigger screen. Okay. Carbon dioxide, when you add it to water, right? This is a chemical reaction I had you folks memorize in the beginning of the semester. I can make carbonic acid. What is an acid? Something that will dissociate and release hydrogen ion, okay? And then, of course, as a byproduct, I have my bicarbonate ion. Bam, okay? If you haven't memorized this, make sure you memorize this because come kidney, you can't even think. You have to go bang, 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 back and forth quickly, right? Now, guess what's in the CSF? We have, right in this junction here, I'm just going to draw a central chemoreceptor. And as all receptors do, they will now come and then they can have a synapse, okay, with a respiratory control center. What color should I make that thing? Well, I'm going to make it purple. No, I'm going to make it blue. I'm trying to remember what I made it when I did the CNS lecture, which was, I don't remember. Hopefully this color matches. Okay, so this is going to be respiratory control centers. Okay, so here, now I'm going to go back to my black pen. What are you folks doing while I'm changing colors? You folks have color pens too? I hope so. This is fun. All right, now here we go. CO2 will come, bind to this central chemoreceptor, right? It's going to depolarize. I send the signal, and I'm going to send the signal to the respiratory control centers. And these are now neuronal cell bodies that are going to control or synapse with the muscle, the breathing muscles in our body to allow us now, in this case, because I've turned it on, I'm going to increase ventilation rate. Okay, does this make sense? Higher CO2 means I got to start breathing faster to let that CO2 out of my body. Otherwise, look at what's happening. I'm getting this buildup of hydrogen ion, and I don't want my body to become acidic because my proteins that run life are going to denature. Now, let's talk about the periphery because both systems are working together. So the periphery is a little bit more fancier than the central nervous system, is because I can both have CO2 and hydrogen bind and stimulate carotid and aortic peripheral. Oh, that's not how you spell it. Start all over. Peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay, and remember, they're like big globs in the carotid and in the aorta, and they just, blood is just flowing by these chemoreceptors and just binding. Okay, so if you have carbon dioxide and hydrogen and you have a lot of them, they'll bind to those chemoreceptors, and if you get enough binding to the chemoreceptors, you're gonna light those chemoreceptors up. Okay, they'll depolarize, and guess what? These chemoreceptors are wired to go talk to the respiratory control centers in the medulla oblongata. So then, of course, I've got two chemoreceptors talking to the respiratory control centers and saying, hey, increase ventilation rate. So I'll just do a double increase because it just came from two places. Okay. So in response, what's going to happen? I'm going to draw it in green so we don't get lost. Little division of what's going on in here, right? So if I increase ventilation rate, I'm going to, one, increase in my bloodstream. That's what I mean by plasma. Increase plasma partial pressure of oxygen. And all that means is I've increased oxygen levels in my body. Why didn't I just say that? Is because a lot of the notation in books and stuff that you folks need to know, this is the notation. So I want to make sure that I prepare you. All right. Now, in turn, I'm also getting rid of what? Carbon dioxide. So P, partial pressure of CO2, will drop. Okay. Now, what's going to happen here? Let me just change my red, my pen to red. It's because now I'm going to start shutting things off, right? So ultimately, both of this little combination of gases, high O2, low CO2, will now shut off the chemoreceptors in the periphery, right? It's kind of like a negative feedback. Negative feedback. This is negative feedback. And I'm also going to shut down the initial okay, the initial source of this rise in partial pressure of carbon dioxide, so that I decrease all of the carbon dioxide coming into the central nervous system as well. Okay, that is how we regulate via chemoreceptors. All right, now what I want to do is I want to talk about these respiratory control centers, and we've been doing this since the CNS lecture, but I'm just going to get into a little bit more detail. So remember, down here, that's the medulla oblongata. So I have a few nuclei that are facilitating ventilation rate, and I'm going to draw one of them right here. Got to make sure I leave enough room. And this one is something called the DRG. Okay, so let's write out. D stands for dorsal. R stands for respiratory. And G stands for group of neurons that are controlling respiration, that are in the dorsal part of the body. Okay, and so the DRG is now sending signals. This is output signals, right? Mostly to the diaphragm and some other breathing muscles, but I promise you, we're just going to do the diaphragm. Diaphragm. That's it. Okay, so that's to the diaphragm. So if the DRG lights up, send the signal to the diaphragm muscle, and then that'll allow the muscle to contract faster, which will allow us now to increase our breathing rate. So the DRG now is receiving inputs, and let me draw in another color. And I will draw it in red. Remember all of our chemoreceptors? Yes? Yes, I'm going to put chemoreceptors. Whoa, I ran out of space. That says chemoreceptors, okay? And remember, they're sending inputs to the DRG. Okay, now there's another respiratory group, and I'm going to go and put it in the same color as the dorsal group because it's both in the same area in the medulla oblongata. This thing is called the VRG. Yeah. Ventral respiratory group. Already denoted up here, okay? So the ventral respiratory group, there's a couple things going on in the ventral respiratory group, and one of the things is it's also innervating muscles, and this is all muscles of the airway. So it keeps airway open. Okay. I'm just going to put keeps airway muscles open during breathing. I mean, because we forget, right? The mouth, all the throat. If you can close down, I'm doing it right now. You can close down all those muscles and you can't have air come out of that shared passageway of the throat, of the larynx. So if you want to breathe, all of those muscles need to be open. And that's what the VRG is doing. One of the things. Okay. Now, the VRG is special because it has a group of cells in here. And I'm going to make a little stripe. Okay. And I'm going to label this stripe. This is something called the pre-Bot-Zinger complex. Okay, and I'm going to write it up here too. So remember the VRG, part of the VRG, this is a structure within the ventral respiratory group. This is the pre-Bot-Zinger complex. And in here contains spontaneously firing neurons. What does that mean? We have a pacemaker. We have another pacemaker here. Oh my God, I'm getting chicken skin. Or you folks call it goosebumps. Okay, so pacemaker for respiratory rhythm. Haha. Okay, so meaning that these pre-Bot-Zinger cells will fire in their own rhythm, which will control now our breathing rate. So that means that the VRG and the DRG have to have the ability to talk to one another. Excuse me. You folks got that? Okay. Now, interestingly, we can also control our breathing rate consciously. Yes? Listen. Right? That's all controlling my breathing rate. And that's all via higher brain center. So let's draw that pathway. Don't mind me. And I'm coughing on purpose to clear my airway, and that's all consciously. This is all this pathway I'm about to draw. This is something called the PRG. Okay, let's denote that. This is the P, which stands for pontine, because it's in the ponds. Look at the ponds. Okay, so pontine, guess what? Respiratory group. Okay, so the pontine respiratory group, aka PRG, is a middleman or middle woman. Okay, it's a middle structure that allows us now to have these interneurons, that allows us to have synapses with the higher brain. Okay, so the higher brain centers are controlling this. So let me draw higher brain centers in red. And what do we mean by higher brain centers? Limbic system, cerebral cortex, all of those higher brain centers. Am I afraid? Am I nervous? I'm going to start to hyperventilate, right? Okay. So the higher brain centers will now send signals to the pontine respiratory group. And in turn, the pontine respiratory group is going to now light up. What color? Green. Both the VRG and the DRG. And yes, there's communication back and forth. So I'll just draw some arrows like this so we're not confused. Okay. PRG can talk to the ventral and the dorsal respiratory group. They can all talk to one another. Okay. So if I get excited, higher brain center, I send a signal that lights up the neuron cell bodies in the PRG. The PRG now will send a signal to the ventral respiratory group and tell the pre-Botzinger cells, hey, speed it up. Also tell the DRG, hey, start contracting that diaphragm over and over, faster and faster. But I do get communication between VRG and the DRG telling each other the same thing. There's a lot of repetition in the body. That's just always, okay? Now, that's the wiring, right? And so ventilation then is going to be constantly modulated, aka changed by chemoreceptors, right? Higher brain functions in order for us to maintain some type of acid homeostasis and oxygen homeostasis, because we do need oxygen to make lots of ATP. Now, a couple things that I want to bring to your folks' attention, and let me just change my pen back to black, is there's a couple conditions where this respiratory control center comes into play. And this is sleep apnea. So I don't know if you folks know what sleep apnea is, but sleep apnea is when somebody's sleeping and all of a sudden they stop breathing, which is not fun. And I know a few people that have sleep apnea, and they tell me that, I mean, they don't sleep a lot. Is because every time they finally do fall asleep, and of course this depends on how severe your sleep apnea is, but as soon as you fall asleep, you stop breathing. So carbon dioxide builds up, and then all of a sudden they're gasping for breath, right? Is because the chemoreceptors are lighting up, and then you're actually waking up is because you're gasping for breath. And so you don't sleep that much. And for sleep apnea, there's two main types of sleep apnea. So the first type is something called obstructive. And all that is when the airway becomes blocked during sleep. You can pump the diaphragm, but the muscles are starting to collapse and cause the throat to collapse, and you can't get air in or out. Now, another way is central. And via central, right, is that the brain nuclei in here, and one of these, it's not sending any motor signals, and that is not good. I remember one of my students said that her friend's daughter, when as a baby, had central sleep apnea, and they were sleeping in the same room, and all of a sudden they didn't hear the baby breathing, and later they found that the dorsal respiratory group was not firing. All right, so that's the respiratory control center. So what I want to do now is just briefly talk about sleep apnea. So some of the things you can do for sleep apnea is use this CPAP machine. And CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure. And so lots of people think that this is oxygen, that they're delivering oxygen, and that's not the case. And what it's doing is creating a higher pressure system in here in order to keep that upper airway open, so those muscles aren't collapsing the throat. The thing, what people who have sleep apnea have told me is it's uncomfortable to sleep with a mask. Some people can just sleep, but for the most part, a lot of people don't like the mask because it keeps them awake anyway, and they're still not sleeping. There is something called Inspire, and this is a fairly new procedure, just born 2 or 3 years ago. And what it does is you actually have something kind of like a pacemaker, but it's an electronic device that they put inside your body. And they allow now the cords to be innervating the muscles in the airway, right? So that it now allows the muscles in the airway to stay open the whole time, to kind of bypass the need for a CPAP. All right, that's it for this lecturette. Come back, because now we're going to talk about gas transport. FUN.